Welcome to Global Perspectives. How does the transatlantic relationship contribute to U.S. security? For answers, we turn to Mark Hertling, the former commanding general of the U.S. Army in Europe.
Global Perspectives with Pulitzer Prize-winning commentator John Bercia.
Welcome to the show, Mark.
It's an honor to be here with you, John.
Why don't we go back to the beginning a little bit, before you were the famous general, where you grew up? Were you always interested in the U.S. military? Or was that something that happened by chance? What are some of those details?
Yeah, I was born and raised in St. Louis, Missouri. Had an interesting background. I grew up in a family that was part of the low-income spectrum. So when it was time to graduate from high school and go off to college, I had the opportunity through a great guidance counselor that said, hey, you know, you're probably not going to be able to afford the tuition for some of the schools you want, so here's a couple of other options. And one of the options was someplace I had read about, knew very little about, but had seen the reputation of the United States Military Academy. So through this guidance counselor, she helped me get a nomination and then eventually an appointment to West Point. So I entered the class of 75 in the summer of 1971, when the world was sort of focused on places like Vietnam and Southwest Asia. And by the time I graduated, that war had concluded. And my first assignment in graduating from the military academy was U.S. Army Europe as a young second lieutenant. So going from St. Louis, which I had never left until I flew to New York when I was 18 years old to begin the academy, to having my first trip overseas and seeing a new culture and new kinds of people and a very interesting world outside the confines of that small Midwestern town was pretty fascinating for this young kid from Missouri.
Were you the first in your family by chance to graduate from college?
No, my brother was actually, and he sponged up all the family's money in order to go to the University of Notre Dame. So when it came time for me, there was not a whole lot left. But that was my first choice, to go to Notre Dame, and I'm thankful that I actually went to West Point instead.
Those initial cultural experiences, exchanges that you had upon traveling overseas for the first time, what was the most interesting, different, surprising thing that you learned? Because everyone has a different experience.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was everything. The language, the people, the way the people conducted themselves, the elements of the culture, the good beer in Germany, but also the mission. One of the first things I was asked to do as a young second lieutenant, I was commissioned into the Armor Corps, so I was a tanker, was to conduct border operations between the east and west German border. So we were at a very small border camp, actually in the corner between the what was then Czechoslovakia, now the Czech Republic, West Germany and East Germany. And we were able to see, as young people, the opportunities for freedom on the western side of that border, while the eastern side was still under the Soviet bloc oppression. And in fact, as a young man, as a young lieutenant one time guarding that border, we saw a couple of individuals who actually were trying to escape the east and come to the west, who were shot by border guards, an entire family, in the middle of what they called, at the time, the 1K zone. So that was very impressionable. It gave me for the first time an understanding of what freedom and dignity and respect for people really was. You know, we talk a lot about that in our social science classes and our culture classes, but this was the first time I had seen oppression on a large scale and people wanting to be free.
What were the thoughts in your mind when the Iron Curtain started to come down in the late 80s?
Well, interestingly enough, so my first trip to Europe was as a young second lieutenant, was in 1975, 76, 77. Came back to the United States to continue on with my military career, but then in 1988, I went back to Europe. So I was actually there again on a border wall when the wall came down. We were at a different border camp, and in fact I was a young major at the time and was a little bit confused about what was happening. We were trying to get orders regarding what to do, how to handle this flood of refugees that was coming from the east to the west looking for freedom. We were seeing the television images of the wall in Berlin coming down and the exuberance of the German people as they reunited their government. My family, my wife and I were married and had two young sons that were living occurring in Germany, and we were in a neighborhood where a lot of the refugees from the old East German government came in and actually were looking for jobs. So we got to meet them firsthand in this little town of Ansbach in the center of Bavaria. So my experience the first time was seeing the wall up. My experience the second time was seeing the wall come down, and not only the reunification of East and West and the deterioration of all the other Soviet bloc states like the Czech Republic, Yugoslavia, Romania, Bulgaria, but it was also the time for the peace dividend in the United States. You know, up to that point, we had about 250,000 soldiers in Europe. In the 70s, 60s, 50s. Well, suddenly there was an indication that that was rapidly going to go down, and it did in the 90s as a result of the peace dividend. But then, interestingly enough, from Germany, I was with a unit that was sent to Desert Storm combat in the Middle East. So we were actually going from a defensive posture against the Soviet bloc, which had now deteriorated, into offensive warfare in the Middle East in an entirely different environment with a force that had been trained in the woodlands of Germany.
And then tell us, you came back to Europe again in
I
your
did.
Senior capacity,
Right.
the last one, and
Well,
one of the last
interestingly
ones,
enough, after Desert Storm was over, we came out of the Middle East, went back to Germany for a short period of time, and then I went back to the United States in a new assignment. The years passed, and in 2003, after a tour on the Joint Staff, I was in the Pentagon when 9/11 hit and saw the planes hit not only the buildings in New York, but also at the Pentagon. I was then sent back to Europe to be with a unit that was going to, one more time, fight in Iraq. So my wife and children went to Germany. I spent one night in Germany in 2003 and then immediately went for a 15-month tour in Iraq. Returned in 2004, and actually 9 of the next 11 years I was stationed in Germany through a very interesting time where we were not only transforming the size of the United States military force in Europe, but it was also a time when we were connecting with new partners, new allies, and I watched NATO grow to the 28 nations that it became, now 29.
Let's talk about those pieces of the transatlantic relationship. We have NATO, we have the economic issues, we have human security issues,
Right.
ranging from human rights to human trafficking as a subset of human rights. All of these things are fascinating. Your main experience has been in the military,
Right.
national security realm. How important is the transatlantic relationship
It's critically
to
important.
U.S. security
Yeah,
today?
it's critically important. Not only NATO, but I think many Americans are confused about what NATO is. It is a group of now 29 countries, 2 of which are the United States and Canada, the rest that are in Europe. However, one of the things I learned as the commanding general of Europe, didn't learn it but knew it all along, was there are a total of 51 countries in the European theater. So many of those nations are not a part of NATO. So the alliance is one thing, the partnership is quite another. And it's a very fascinating, intricately woven machination of countries with a variety of cultures, more languages than you can count, more fault lines than you can pinpoint throughout the European face. As I was commanding Europe in the U.S. Army in Europe in 2010 through 12, what I found was a lot of members of our Congress, our governing bodies believe that Europe is one thing, and it's mostly Germany. And what we had to continuously portray as part of the transatlantic alliance was there are 51 countries in this bloc. Each one of them are very different, and not all countries are any country in Europe. They all have different needs, different desires, different security concerns. So as I traveled around to those various nations, I would always make contact with our U.S. ambassador and our country teams, but also talk to not only my military counterpart in the various countries, but also many of the government counterparts, in some cases the presidents or the prime ministers. And it was fascinating to see how each one of them contributed in their own special way to a common security after experiencing the types of conflicts they had seen in the 19th and early part of the 20th century.
Talk to us about some of the security concerns that spill over to the United States. We have the refugee problem.
Right.
We have political violence happening in a number of these countries. We have the issue of certain types of political violence being imported into Europe. We have the ongoing tensions between East and West that seem to have resumed, especially vis-a-vis Russia and its resurgence. It seems immensely complicated. How do you sort it all out?
Yeah, well, there are different problem sets, to be sure. The primary problem set I saw when I was commanding in 2010 through 2012 was the Russian expansionism. And it was felt by many countries. When I was commanding a tank division in northern Iraq, one of the small battalions we had with us was from the country of Georgia. And that was in 2007, 2008. Well, halfway through my tour in Iraq, I got a call saying, get those guys from the Georgian army back to their country because the Russians have invaded Abkhazia and South Ossetia. So we literally had to stop operations to help these Georgian soldiers return to defend their own country and their capital, Tbilisi. So you have the Russian expansionism that is felt primarily by all of the countries that were part of the Soviet bloc. And many of those countries are not NATO alliances. So they feel sometimes that they are alone and unafraid, caught between the West, which they want to be a part of, and an increasingly expanding Russia, especially under Mr. Putin. So that's one problem set. The other problem set, as you pointed out, is what we called the rat lines of terrorists. It started in the Balkans during that war and the breakup of the former Republic of Yugoslavia, when you had various entities from the Middle East coming into some parts of the Balkans, Serbia, Kosovo, attempting to influence the religious culture there. And some were Wahhabist and Salafist, the extreme view of Islam, and they were attempting to influence the southern part of the NATO and European landmass. That's grown since the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and now Syria, with increased immigration and refugee concerns, not only out of Syria, but also out of the northern republics of Africa, coming across the Mediterranean, trying to get into the south of France and Italy. So you had the concern of the more eastern part of Europe, which was the old Russian fear. Then you had the southern portion and some of the countries where terrorists and refugees were going to colonize or attempt to try and influence the different states. And then you had the economic problems associated with the European Union and how the different countries were contributing to that. Now you have increasing concerns about things such as Brexit and nationalism. So what used to be a relatively simplistic block of East versus West that sort of came to the forefront in Europe and particularly in Germany and the North German plain, now is a hodgepodge of challenges on the European landmass. And then if you take a look in some other places, you have the issues of piracy that are influencing parts of the Mediterranean and certainly the Arab Sea and the Atlantic off the coast of Spain and Portugal. You also have cyber concerns, which has happened in the Baltic countries in the late 1990s and early 2000s, where some actor, we think it was Russia, was attempting to influence democratic elections in places like Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania. You have also the potential for just the Schengen zone flowing people back and forth between the different countries that are now open to transit. And of course, there's also human trafficking. We saw not only human sex trafficking out of the east into NATO, territory, but also the effects of human trafficking that would go to the shores of Amsterdam and into other places throughout the world. So really the number of security concerns that require a common approach to eliminate or reduce the threat are significant.
Does it surprise you that a resurgent Russia with a leader who is nationalistic and has, I'm sure, dreams of restoring Russia to its former glory, is any of this a surprise to you? Or is it something we should have anticipated?
I don't think we should have anticipated as early as 2004 and 5 because it appeared that Russia at the time was rejoining the global League of Nations. And they were looking for more democratic and institutional resolve and transformation within their government and their armed forces. I think a lot of this has become resurgent because of the personalities of a few people. And interestingly enough, there's a great book called The Little War That Shook the World, about what happened in Georgia in 2008. And it all started kind of matriculating in the 2005-2006 timeframe, primarily driven by President Putin and his fear that the West was trying to influence his country of Russia.
So as we look to the future and think about how best to manage this relationship, how important is NATO? How important is maintaining that transatlantic tie? And what are some of the scenarios that you see, maybe not in terms of specifics, but some of the things generally that could develop that might threaten this relationship?
Yeah, I think it's critically important to maintain the ties. NATO has often been denigrated as being an organization that's lived long past its usefulness. That's not true. From an individual who's worked with and served in NATO, I know that they are constantly evolving to meet the threats and the demands of the countries that are part of the alliance. But when you have now 29 nations coming together and trying to influence what the body does as a whole, it's extremely difficult. But they, as a group, as an alliance, do very good things on a daily basis, and they have adapted to the conflicts in the world. What do I think are the big concerns within the alliance, specifically NATO, but in the rest of the Europe writ large? I think we're going to see challenges in one of our NATO partners, and that's Turkey, continuing to lean in directions that the rest of the alliance does not want to go. You're going to see continued economic challenges where there's a trade-off and a spectrum between fiscal responsibility and maybe irresponsibility on the part of some countries that contribute to the dynamics of the EU and in fact, the security of NATO. And I think one of the things that's going to be interesting that is somewhat outside of the European theater, but it touches on parts of it, specifically Turkey, and that's the Kurdish reform movement that will occur. And President Barzani has said in the fall he wants to take a referendum on independence. If that occurs, it will immediately influence Turkey, but it could also influence the countries of Iraq and Iran, which those nations influence Europe as well. I think one of the key things of the importance of the transatlantic alliance is the fact that it does certainly lay at a crossroads. It always has lain at the crossroads between the Middle East, the Far East, and the West. And it is something where we've seen the alliance over the last 70 years has actually prevented war and conflict on a large scale. And without the alliance and without that common agenda from the 51 countries of NATO and the ability to use diplomatic action, we could see extreme conflicts and increased complexity over the next decade or so.
Could you speculate as to if the U.S. were to disengage completely or substantially from Europe, could you give us a worst case scenario for the U.S. and then would Europe be able to stand on its own? I know that European countries have been asked to take on more responsibility for their own defense.
Right.
Are they collectively capable of defending themselves against resurgent threats?
Yeah, I don't believe they are without the leadership of a major country. There have been some countries who have attempted to step in and provide the leadership when the leadership of the United States has waned a little bit, and that's not just under the current administration. That was under the last administration when the announcement was made of the pivot or the reapproach to the East as opposed to Europe. And I think there was some real challenges within most of the European governments when that was announced by President Obama. There is much more challenges today as there is a concern about what the current Trump administration is doing with future relationships. It's problematic because this is not only a crossroads for security, it's a crossroads for economic interest as well. And I don't think in today's global environment, and I know I'm a soldier and I'm speaking outside my lane when I start talking about global and international business issues, but from what I've seen as one of the key leaders in the military, is so important to what we do on a global nation to ensure the transparencies between countries and the free trade of goods. That's part of what the Security Alliance is all about, to ensure that free trade occurs. I mean, I'll just use the example of the establishment of the Schengen zone in Europe. That would have never occurred and would have never created the wealth for European countries had it not been the establishment of security after the fall of the wall and the Iron Curtain.
If you were making recommendations to the leadership in the United States about the types of relationships the United States should have with Europe going forward over the next 5 to 10 years, what would be 2 or 3 recommendations, concise, clear recommendations that you would make?
Well, I would say continue to look for ways to strengthen NATO and to adjust it, to look for ways to continue to support the European Union, because I believe that it is certainly seeing some challenges right now to the continued existence. We should look for the types of security threats that our allies can help us with. And what I mean by that is the flow of refugees, the expansion of Russia, and human trafficking and piracy, as well as cybersecurity. What I'll tell you from the standpoint of a military leader is we had significant progress with the various NATO centers of excellence in dealing with things such as cyber, such as terrorism, such as human trafficking. There were various countries who took the lead and said, we will form the ability to counter these kinds of threats to the improved culture of mankind. And that was extremely valuable. The other piece is, you know, I think it was Winston Churchill who once said that the worst way to fight a war is with an alliance, but there's no better way to do it. And without an alliance, it's much more difficult. So what we have to continue to do with NATO and with the various European corps is look for ways to combine the strength of forces to countering any kind of aggression against human dignity and human democracy and governmental democracy.
We're down to our last few seconds, but just quickly, it sounds like there's a book in all of this. Is that something you've thought about or planning, et cetera? I had a terrific career in the military. I had a lot of really interesting times from a young kid who grew up in Missouri and then started traveling the world. I don't know if a book would be that interesting to other people, but it certainly was an interesting life to me. And I would be hesitant to write a book because the stories may grow in size and dimension from what they originally occurred. But it's always good to try and pass on the kind of experiences I've had to the younger generation so they don't make the same mistakes I did. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Mark Kirtley. It's a pleasure. Thank you. And thank you. For Global Perspectives, I'm John Bercia, and we'll see you next time.